Presenta una comunicazione dal titolo Enigmatic Structures in the Maltese Landscape, the section of the prehistoric and megalithic temples in later ancient times.
Innanzitutto ringrazio il comitato organizzativo di cui faccio parte per questa occasione di indirizzare un'udienza così distinta. Devo anche dire che l'intervento del presentatore del filmato mi ha fatto ricordare la mia presenza al convegno di Corleone, quando intervenne anche il professor Contu, e mi ricordo bene che mi ha emozionato moltissimo la lettura della sua poesia fatta da se stesso. Anche se non sono sardo, mi sentivo in quell'occasione sardo con tutte le aspirazioni per nuovi orizzonti nell'età moderna. Dunque, mi devo anche scusare di chiedervi di perdonarmi se presento questo intervento in inglese perché vi faccio fare uno sforzo. Volevo tradurre in italiano dopo un mio primo intervento, ma il programma è arrivato in quell'occasione, che siccome era presentato nel programma in inglese, allora ho ritenuto essere rispettare il programma. Dunque, enigmatic structures in the Maltese landscapes, the reception of prehistoric megalithic temples in later ancient times. One of the pressing questions that intrigue archaeologists of the European and Mediterranean regions concerns the apparent failure of the astounding megalithic structures to impress or stimulate some cultural reaction or interaction among the literate and articulate peoples of the classical world, as opposed to those of the modern world and to some extent the medieval one. There is barely any reference to such structures in their literature. There is barely any reuse of such structures as there is, for example, of monumental Greco-Roman buildings, such as the Theatre of Marcellus, the Colosseum, and the mausoleums of Augustus and Hadrian in Rome, and the amphitheatres of Arles and Cura, that were reused in post-classical times for completely different purposes. An exception I can think of is that of an Iron Age fortress, on top of which the monastery library of Gojavan in Armenia was built. Here in Sardegna I can think of some or many, in fact, Nuraghi structures that were reused in Phoenician and Punic times. Faccio vedere volumi come icona. In the case of the Maltese Islands, which experienced an extraordinary megalithic culture, with its outstanding architecture as well as a substantial figurative repertoire, the first recorded interaction with its remains is that of an erudite French gentleman, Jean Quentin d'Autun, who arrived in Malta with the order of the Knights of St. John in 1530 and spent the following 3 years on the island and eventually published a pamphlet, which you see there, a pamphlet containing the earliest description of Malta. He must have been struck by the sheer size of the building blocks of 2 extensive clusters of ruins. To my mind, clearly of a prehistoric typology, he must have seen with his own eyes, one in the Grand Harbour and one near Massachusetts Harbour. However, Quentin, like his contemporaries and those of several generations later, could still not conceive a remote age for human existence prior to that narrated by the Bible or the ancient Greco-Roman texts. And it is not surprising, therefore, that they identified these ruins with those of two classical sanctuaries, the sanctuary of Juno and the sanctuary of Heracles, mentioned in Cicero and Ptolemy, with whose writings he was familiar. A century later, the Maltese antiquarian Giovanni Francesco Abena attributed the construction of all visible megalithic buildings in Malta to a race of giants, even though he seems to associate Malta with the Homeric island of the Phaeacians. Most antiquarians that followed until the end of the 19th century assigned them to the Phoenicians. It was only with the opening of the 20th century that they were placed firmly in prehistoric times by the German scholar Albert Meyer. In a paper I presented during a Cambridge interdisciplinary conference in 2006, a first attempt was made to investigate the reception of the Maltese megalithic temple structures in Phoenician times, comparing and contrasting two prehistoric temple sites in which drastic intervention seemed to have occurred during the Phoenician Punic occupation of the islands. This contribution intends to provide an updated review of that position following some important discoveries that have entered into the public domain since then. Up to now, no information pertaining to the upper stratigraphic units corresponding to the top levels of the standing walls of the Maltese megalithic temples is, for some reason or other, available to the researcher. The most spectacular sites of Gigantia in Gozo and Hajar East and the Nida in Malta were cleared of their infill deposits in the first half of the 19th century, 1820, 1839, 1840 respectively. In these cases, as in the cases of most minor temple sites on both islands, those top levels had never been covered over completely and remained visible for the last 4 to 5 millennia. Remarkable exceptions to the above situation are very few sites, two, in fact, that were somehow totally buried and were brought to the surface by archaeologists. The first one was Karshin. The first one was the Tarshin megalithic complex. Yes, la prima era Hajarin, come vista da Jean Wells, e questa è Gigantia a Gozo. Questa è Gigantia a Gozo. Sì, dunque, remarkable exceptions to the above situation are very few sites, two in fact, that were somehow totally buried and were brought to the surface by archaeologists. The first one was the Tarshin megalithic complex, excavated in the years 1915 to 1918. The second one was the Tastilj complex, brought to light mainly in two stages, in 1963 to 1970 and in 2003 to 2016. A third megalithic site, consisting of two temple units excavated by David Trump and his wife Bridget in the years 1961 to 1963, was only partly covered up to the top levels of the stone features. But Trump's reports on his excavation there are completely silent about any post-prehistoric human activity on the site. The excavations conducted before Zanni such as those by A. Caruana in the late years of the 19th century at Borcin-Nadu, and by Ashby, Keats, and Tagliaferro at Santa Verna in 1911, were too early for us to expect from them a reliable distinction of prehistoric pottery from later ones. The discovery and excavation of the Tarshian temple complex in the years 1915-1918 marked a paradigm shift in the history of Maltese archaeology, mainly because the site was completely covered over by a sequence of deposits, including relatively modern agricultural activity and field formation. At Tarshian, the excavator, Termiz Amit, did not apply the stratigraphic method as we do nowadays. Nevertheless, he succeeded in identifying and peel off separately 3 distinct layers. The lowest one corresponding to the temple period, a middle one of sterile sand, and the topmost one belonging to the early Bronze Age, when a section of the temple complex was reused as a cremation cemetery. More pertinent to the subject matter of this paper, Thomas Ashby also identified significant later interventions, including the insertion of a Roman wall in the inner apse of the Middle Temple of Tarshian, while Zambi had come across the presence of a thick deposit of what he called punic pottery in the layers above the prehistoric ones. Reference to these, however, is found only in his field notebooks, not in the published versions of his reports. I have already used Zambi's field notebooks in my paper for the Cambridge meeting of 2006. For brevity's sake, therefore, I shall limit myself to my main conclusion. In my Cambridge paper, I concluded that the Tarshian site was used by the Phoenicians or their Punic successors as a convenient quarry for building stone. We have no idea for which building the quarried stone was intended. So far, no remains of outstanding ancient buildings in the immediate vicinity have been recorded. But why didn't the same thing happen to any of the other megalithic buildings? The Chikantia complex, the largest and best preserved one on the smaller island of Gozo, was built mainly of very roughly faced hard coralline limestone. As such, hardly attractive for reuse in times when the preferred building stone was the parallelepiped or ashlar block laid in horizontal courses, the so-called opus quadratum, or with vertical blocks with infill of small, roughly shaped blocks, the opus africanum. Besides its location inland, on higher ground, on the edge of a ridge looking over a fertile valley, did not seem to attract attention for reuse in ancient historical times, or even later. Neither did Hajar-in nor Naidra preserve any hint of reuse, probably because of their distance away from safe harbors, even though use of the softer Globigerina limestone was made in them, albeit in different degrees. It's not similar. You see, you must have been seeing these cuttings into the edges of the blocks, to which I shall come back later on. What has turned out to be the second major prehistoric site to be excavated in the 1960s and in the first 2 decades of the present century is that of the multi-millennial sanctuary of Tassilch. The major bases of the site, with their respective structures, were rather rapidly uncovered in the years 1963 to 1970. By Dimensione Archeologica, Malta, which at that time was only interested in the ancient historical, that is, classical bases. These included the foundations of a typical prehistoric temple. A return of the same Dimensione to the site after an almost 30-year interval focused on the prehistoric bases of the site. unfortunately si tratta della sezione a sinistra, cioè a ovest del tempio centrale, che si vede bene a destra. Unfortunately, the raw archives of both expeditions are kept in Rome and are not really accessible in water, presumably because they are being intensively studied for the publication of the various definitive reports. The preliminary reports published soon after each annual campaign of the 1960s already revealed a lot about what happened to the prehistoric relics on site, even if limited to its very core. Here, a prehistoric temple unit of the standard type, like the contemporary ones of Twentia, Tarshin, Hajar Iman, and Nidra, seems to have been so well preserved, at least with its inner and outer walls up to the lowest course of autostats still standing, that the Phoenicians, soon after their permanent establishment on the island, turned it into an extra-urban temple of their own. This continued to be used with additions and adaptations for the same purpose, namely as a temple, in this case now dedicated to Ashtar, Hera, Juno, up to late imperial times, after which a section of it was turned into a Christian church. The second series of campaigns conducted in the years 2001-2016 have revealed a completely different interaction between the Phoenicians and their historical successors with respect to the rest of the megalithic remains on top of the Tassili hill. While the life of the adjacent megalithic temple was extended for another millennium, 3 more megalithic structures of the same age, but not of the same form, were ransacked and exploited only for their building materials and eventually covered and converted into fields. Since the stratigraphic account of the latter excavation is still not available, it is not possible to tell whether the situation here parallels that of the Tarshian temples, in the excavation records of which, as mentioned above, we find frequent mention of abundant Punic pottery in association with an intensive activity of breaking up the surviving prehistoric building blocks for reuse purposes. On the other hand, an inspection of the newly excavated area to the northeast of the reused temple revealed that most of the partially surviving building blocks carry signs of the same type of quarrying activity as that experienced at Tarshin. The evidence for this activity comes from marks left by the use of metal wedges on the edges of broken building blocks. Each of them consists of the remaining side of a narrow channel that was chiseled on one side of the smooth back. The records published so far do not concern the upper levels I am referring to, except for the exceptional find of a crescent-shaped agate with a Mesopotamian inscription in cuneiform script, itself dated to the 12th century, but found in a 4th century stratigraphic context. Whenever the raw records of these are made available, they will undoubtedly shed more light on the subject of this paper. In conclusion, whereas before we had evidence of 2 opposite interactions with the historic remains by later Phoenician Punic inhabitants of the Maltese islands, namely the structured exploitation of building material at the Tarshian temples, in contrast with the preservation and reuse of the previous well-preserved megalithic temple at Tassili, now we have evidence for the 2 opposite interactions also in one and the same site, that is at Tassili. I would like you to consider this contribution as work in progress, just another modest brick in the edifice under construction of a history of archaeology in Malta. That's the